Hello, thank you for coming. My name's Tim Dawson. I'm about to give this talk about Assault Android Cactus. Just a quick question: who knows about who's heard of the game before? All right, cool. So first of all, I'm an Australian developer. I came from Brisbane, Australia, so I've travelled a fair bit to get here. And I'm 1/3 of a small indie company called Witchbeam. Before that, I used to work at larger companies, primarily as an animator. But I was teaching myself programming, mostly through learning Unity. And a kind of alternate title for the talk could have been How Unity Encouraged Me to Quit My Job, Spend the Next 3 years Miserable, but I Think I'm Kind of Okay with It. And yeah, so the game itself, since a lot of you are coming in fresh, I'll just show this is the launch trailer.
This is Junior Constable Cactus, and I'm on approach.
Listen to me, Cactus. There's no way on board.
I think I see an opening. It's okay, folks. I do that kind of thing all the time. Battery up. Who's next?
We're just getting started.
And that's my game. So what is it? It's, we normally describe it as an intense twin-stick shooter, which makes most people roll their eyes a bit, because twin-stick shooter. What people generally notice quickly is it combines other aspects. A lot of people notice the bullet hell aspects and the fact that we're bringing in kind of Japanese arcade shooting mechanics as well, giant bosses, transforming stages, kind of what we could do, but to mix it up, but it's effectively an arena shooter, but it's an arena shooter that we've very consciously tried to push in various ways. We started development in 2013. That was when we quit our jobs to work on it full time. I had a functional prototype at that point, but that was the real start of final development. And we went into early access later that year, assuming we would ship the game maybe in another 7 months or so. That didn't turn out to be the case, because we shipped it in 2015 towards the end of the year. And then on PS4. We did pretty well on PS4 critically, which I'm very polite about, and our Steam users like us a lot. So it kind of, for the most part, it seems to be a pretty decent game. And the question was, like, why did we make this game? Why did we sit down and make a twin-stick shooter? The main one was we had a prototype that was already good and that was already fun. This was a hobby project of mine that grew into something a bit more. And we realized, and actually, I've been saying we a lot, but so the 3-person team, we've got myself, Sanardan, and Jeff. Sanardan's, I do the art and programming, so I do a lot of the heavy lifting. Sanardan is a game designer who really keeps the game kind of on keel and balanced, and Jeff is our composer and sound designer. And basically, like, that seems like a pretty major role for a game, but our audio is pretty amazing, so we're very, very lucky to have him. And so me and Nart decided to make this game and to kick this off. And we realized that we wanted to make this game. It was something we enjoyed, and we thought we could do a really good job with it. We thought it was in our wheelhouse. We were both very technical designers, and we were very finicky about getting game balance right. And we thought it was the kind of game that was all about its game feel, its balance, and how it worked. And basically, a lot of people say there's a lot of twin-stick shooters, but outside Housemarque and Geometry Wars, there's not a lot on the market that chases that sense of that real, flowing, tactile, good-feeling twin-stick shoot-'em-up action. So we actually thought we had a market opportunity. The ways we tried to make it more than a twin-stick shooter, and what we wanted to try to bring to the table, was that we weren't going on nostalgia, we were trying to really pull it apart and think about what is this game, what does it mean for us, and what can we bring to it. Me and Nart both had a very strong approach of brutal honesty, where we would pull apart systems and really question whether they needed to be in the game, what they were doing for the game, and that was fundamental to the start of the game. We had to question everything, and not just put things in for convention's sake. A lot of the mechanics were balanced around how they reinforce the game as a whole. System-wise, it's hard to see from the trailer, but we don't have a lot of systems going on. There's a power-up system, there's a weapon power-up system. You have 2 weapons that you can swap between. The secondary weapon runs out of, or overheats, and you have to switch back to your primary weapon. But the thing is, every one of those mechanics interfaces with each other in various ways. And that was really important. So we're basically maximizing the amount of gameplay we're getting out of a minimal amount of work. Well, I say minimal amount of work, but that's... And so what we end up with is a game that people would come by at conventions and say, oh, I know that game, it looks like Smash TV, or it looks like something else they've played. And it really wouldn't impact on them just what it was until they'd played it for a while. And we thought that was really cool. So the key, I say the key mechanic, but one of the striking mechanics that people notice in the game is that there's a giant battery meter at the top of the screen when you're playing. And early on, we realized, this was actually Sanardan's first big insight into the game, was the game played great when you're aggressively fighting all the enemies and running at them and chasing them down. But the moment you started hesitating, the moment you hung behind walls and let them find you, the moment you played conservatively, the game really slowed down. And that's pretty standard if you've seen a lot of twin-stick shooters where a kiting mechanic is basically the dominant strategy. You're just kind of backwards reeling around the map, waiting for the enemies to go away. And the insight from that was that we needed something to force you to engage the players, and we put a great big timer on the screen. If you don't destroy enemies fast enough, they don't drop a battery, and the level ends. That realization sort of flipped things on its head, because once you have a way of dying, you can run out of battery. You don't need a getting knocked down way of dying. So you can get up an unlimited number of times. It's only the battery that ends up finishing you off. And that made the game way more aggressive. It pushed you to constantly go from enemy to enemy to enemy. And if you slowed down, if you took too long to deal with a wave of enemies, you're only hurting yourself. And that became really exciting. And that meant that it was a game that when you were struggling with a level, you were encouraged to be more reckless rather than more conservative, which was the key mechanic. And the interesting thing about this is we have these large boss fights where you're fighting these giant screen-filling enemies. And in a top-down shooter, they're typically a war of attrition, where you sit there at the bottom of the screen and dodge bullet patterns until the boss dies. Ours had the interesting property that it's like they're the player, and the boss wants you to take too long, and so that they'll win. So instead, it's up to you to get in through their bullet patterns, get up close, use your weapons effectively, and take down the boss before you run out of time, not them, which was kind of cool and gives the game a kind of unique feel, even among contemporary titles. So the title of the talk was a kind of pun reference to the fact that the game doesn't have a difficulty mode, and it's kind of being criticized a bit, but by people who haven't played the game that much. But the logic behind it was that we didn't have the team size to build 3 modes of difficulty. We didn't have enough time to create that kind of game. And we were very good at tinkering with systems and building systems in. And what I really wanted was a game that would encourage people to kind of sorry, to play it better and to chase those high score systems. So we have in the game, we have chaining. From shooting enemies fast enough, you can link them together and get a combo. At the beginning, you're probably going to drop your combo all of the time, and that's fine. But as you play through the game, you might go, I got a D ranking, how do I get a C? And when you might play the game and get better at it and just organically improve to the point that you beat a level by chaining every single enemy in the entire level together. And that gives you an S+ rank, at which point it actually adds a little interface adds an extra UI element. And that's almost like a second game where you suddenly get to replay all the levels, and every level was designed, every character was designed to allow for this, where you can replay the game and try to get an S+ on each level. And that's a way more exciting game. It's a way harder game, but it's really rewarding, and it sits inside the existing game, and you can access it any time just by playing well, which is cool. It was also about making sure that we weren't giving anyone a reduced or an artificially inflated experience. Like if a reviewer comes through the game and they scrub through it on easy to get through the game quickly, they might say, well, the enemies weren't very interesting, nobody really challenged me. And you're going, oh, no, but if you played on hard, you'd see the real patterns. And it's like, you always get to see the real patterns, you just kind of get to play with them at different levels. And that was super important to us. The other part that this relates to is that when we were building the game, at some point, it stopped becoming about what we wanted to put in the game and was more about what the game needed. And at that point, it's like the game started directing itself. And at that point, it was kind of you either kind of keep pushing and give it what it needs, or you don't. And so in that sense, it kind of felt like it came full circle. So getting a little bit onto the technical, or more of the technical practical sides. Obviously, not surprisingly, the default built-in shaders, this is pre-surface shaders, standard shaders, sorry, didn't look the greatest for our art style, and we've got custom shaders. But what was more important to me about this was the design of the shader. The character shaders in particular was based on my art style, and that the way I would illustrate characters, particularly the way I could choose colors and for skin tones and make materials look the way that I wanted using particular colors. And so for Cactus, I ended up doing a surface shader that uses an ambient map, which is a little bit inefficient memory-wise, but it was fine because it's only for characters, where I'm basically painting the entire texture again, but it's ambient color. And that ended up giving me a lot of control over saturation and per material settings in a way that was just really suited my workflow. So yeah, this is our level workflow. We had 25 levels in the game, set across 5 different tile sets. Breaking things into tile sets was a massively important thing because as the programmer and artist, I was under a lot of pressure. And the way we built the levels, me and Nart both built levels, and we worked a little bit differently, is we would just white box them to start with and get the gameplay working. And that was quite good because you can obviously get them however you want them. I tended to work in Max because I could just push geometry around, and Nart would work in Unity and just build primitives. And once we had the level working and once we had the gameplay the way we wanted, and it was fully playable in Whitebox, I would take a set of tile set that I was working and just snap it together in Max. And that process could go together really fast. So there was a point where I would basically dress like 5 levels in a week in between all my other tasks, and they would just slot in and the gameplay was unaffected. We didn't have a particularly complicated system. We just had different meshes for ground collision, wall collision, and invisible collision, which is for holes or anything that non-flying characters can't move over, like a player. And in Max, I would just set up the geometry. In a few levels, we were able to use box primitives for performance savings. For most of the cases, it ended up being a lot easier just to use mesh colliders because of our complex shapes. And you can see over in the Unity side of things, the The little circles are enemy spawners. The eyeballs are our wayfinding system, which is like a very kind of very simplified A-star, very simplified. That's just basically enough to let enemies pathfind around obvious occlusions and find you. So our game starts off with an opening cutscene. You saw a little bit of it in the trailer. And it was important to me. I started as a cutscene animator, so I was kind of excited to revisit this. But we wanted to run everything in real time, and this was, and I wanted to drive as much as I could from 3D Studio Max because I felt comfortable with it. So we had a fairly normal workflow. I wrote a script. I drew storyboards. The next step was we recorded dialogue ourselves and made it into animatics. And then eventually we ended up getting professional voice actors to come in and voice the roles. And then and then once we updated the animatics, I was building the 3D Studio Max scenes, which would then export into Engine. Whoops. That's all right. The workflow, I'm not sure how typical this is with approaching cutscenes, but the workflow, so I was coming out from 3D Studio Max, and what I wanted was to be able to control almost everything in the scene from a 3D Studio Max file. So I was animating everything, I was bringing in multiple characters, I was bringing in props, I was animating the cameras in using the normal methods. I think I had a camera switching script. And then what I would do is I'd export everything as a node, so no mesh at all, and plug in the characters back into Unity's hierarchy system, because if you can replace a whole character skeleton, you can delete that, replace it with the same named one, and Unity will animate that fine. And then I had a little joiner script that would run through and set up the camera cuts. And this is really straightforward and ugly because it was designed for me to be using, but it did the job great. We had a lot of the enable and disable fields were very important. That's how we turned on and off cameras, how we turned on and off sets, how we turned off characters when they weren't on screen, and it would just run through and on the frame switch over, which meant we didn't get any pops. And that also tied into the subtitle system, which would just put a string ID with a color at a certain time. So I'll just, oops. Sorry about that. So this is the animatic with, oh, we got voices? Maybe.
This is Junior Constable Cactus. I've caught up with the civilian freighter and I'm on approach.
Copy that. You're looking at
That's
the Genki
Jeff.
Star. It sent a garbled message 3 days ago before going silent. We need you in close to scan for anomalies.
Weapons lock detected. Preparing for evasive maneuvers.
Weapons lock? That's a civilian freighter.
Well, there's a lot of lasers pointing at me. I think it used to be their asteroid defense system.
This is beyond the scope of this operation. I'm advising you to abort the mission and retreat immediately.
And file a mission failed report? Ugh, I hate those forms. I'd rather take my chances with the lasers.
Listen to me, Cactus. The hangar is sealed. There's no way on board.
I think I see an opening. It's okay, folks. I'm the police. Commence being calm.
That was amazing. I thought we were done for.
I can't believe you hit those robots with your ship. Oh, no problem. I do this kind of thing all the time.
Save people or crash into things?
Both?
So there you go, full of drama and heroism.
Junior Constable Cactus. I've caught up with the civilian freighter and I'm on approach.
Copy that. You're looking at the Yankee Star. It sent a garbled message 3 days ago before going silent. We need you in close to scan for anomalies.
Weapons lock detected. Preparing for evasive maneuvers.
Weapons lock? That's a civilian freighter.
There's a lot of lasers pointed at me. I think it used to be their asteroid defense system.
This is beyond the scope of the operation. I'm advising you to abort the mission and retreat immediately.
And submit a mission failed report? I hate those forms.
I'll take my chances with the lasers.
Listen to me, Cactus. The hangar is sealed. There's no way on board.
I think I see an opening. It's okay, folks. I'm the police. Commence being calm. That was amazing! I thought we were done for.
Well, I can't believe you hit those robots with your ship.
Oh, no problem. I do that kind of thing all the time.
Save people or crash into things?
Both?
So that's the, yeah, that's the, One fun detail is if you saw the little screens that Cactus is looking at in the spaceship, because it's running at real time and we support arbitrary frame rates, it was important for the screens to run at real time instead. So that's a render texture of some geometry off screen, animating at full frames. There was a fun story actually. Midway through development, a monitor company offered to loan us a 120 hertz monitor for a little bit just to test it out. And we're like, yeah, that sounds great. And I got to see the game, because we were aiming for 60, and I got to see the game animating at different frequencies. Some things would animate at 60, some things would animate at full frame rate, and it horrified me. So I spent the rest of the project making sure that everything runs at whatever frame rate your monitor runs at. And I currently run a G-Sync and can see the game in 144 frames a second. It looks awesome. Speaking of performance, this is the reason why the game runs well at all. It's a pretty decent multimedia laptop, Sierra 2003, and one Christmas, it was all I had when I went back to visit my parents, and I wanted to run the latest build of Cactus that I was working on. And it ran terribly. And I kind of wasn't expecting great performance, but I wasn't expecting 5 frames a second. And so I dug into it, because I didn't have much else to do. Why was the performance really bad? Now, if you've used projectors in Unity, having a projector on every enemy is a really quick way to increase your vertex count to the point that your video card is melting down. And that was what was happening. And so it was easy enough to switch over to a particle system in this case and optimize it back to something playable. But it kind of spooked me a bit, and it meant that started me on the path of always questioning how much something cost in Unity, and looking at the performance costs and keeping a closer eye on that kind of thing. And it was kind of the thing that started that off. We see 60 FPS in our game as a gameplay feature. It's not really negotiable, which is kind of, well, it was put me at odds with some of the other places I've worked at. But for us, it was very important. The game ran smoother. You had a better response time. You could understand what was going on easier. And so we needed to do this, but I'm not the strongest programmer, and I had particular visions for how many enemies I wanted on screen. And the answer was just chipping away at it. The biggest thing was identifying performance as a feature very early on, and always keeping it, because the moment you let it go in one area, it's going to mask other areas, and when you bring it back, you suddenly, you'll fix a script problem and realize you've got a graphics problem, and it just kind of compounds. In our case, it was just about keeping on it all the time. And it was a huge time commitment. I would, especially when we were shipping PS4, I would just spend a lot of days working on the worst levels. And when I got those levels up a few frames, I'd go and work on the second worst level and repeat. And eventually we got a game that actually ran pretty well. But it was a very manual process. But and you learn a lot about Unity internals. Obvious stuff is pooling everything, never instantiating anything in frame, particle systems, using a single particle system instead of like multiple particle systems is a lot more efficient, and a bunch of weird things where you just test one case and test the other case and use the faster one. So I wasn't the best programmer, but I like to think of my process as banging rocks together, and I'm very, very stubborn at banging rocks. So this was a level. We entered the Intel Level Up competition in 2013, and it was a pivotal point for the project. But at the time, it was this demo contest that we'd never heard of before, but it had cool prizes, and we wanted to be part of it. So we created a cut-down version of the game as a demo, including the level Influx, which is the level with the transforming blocks falling away, because it's kind of one of the more interesting, visually interesting levels, and that was done at the time. But just before we submitted it, we read the fine print, because we're not that good at that kind of thing, and realized that the game was going to be assessed on a laptop running a HD 4000 video card. And we're like, oh, well, that's all right. Our game runs fairly well on low-end hardware. I happened to have a laptop that had a HD 4000 video card as its built-in video card. So we disabled 3D acceleration and saw it do it with a dedicated video card to see what it would do. And Influx ran at half the frame rate as the other levels, even though it ran about the same on a normal PC. And so we were going, what's going on with that? I tracked it down. It turned out to be a whole bunch of animators, because the level is created by using a big grid that animates. And having too many animators active, even if they're not animating, was killing this poor little video card. And so this is a video showing the. So this is the gameplay of Influx. And you can see every time you just feed a wave of enemies, or not every time, but periodically, the level is able to completely reconfigure itself in this kind of cool rippling effect. So what's actually happening is we're combining, so this is what the level looks like normally, and then when it transforms, every block switches to a static block, and then when they animate, they swap from the static block to a skinned mesh animator, and then once they hit their finished state, they switch back. And because there's a ripple, it means that you're only having a small amount of animators active in one point. At the end, though, we combine the meshes back into a big single mesh. And the great thing is, because these transitions happen between enemy waves, it's the point where there's the least number of active enemies on the screen anyway. So it ends up being like a low point, and it kind of just smooths out the whole performance graph. And so we went from this level not being kind of playable to it being perfectly playable on the laptop. And it was that kind of realization that keeping skin mesh renderers off the screen if possible, and that kind of thing, that was also led to optimization. So some of the stuff that I ran into while trying to get the frame rate up. Synthetic tests are great. I love creating this 1,000 enemy cube to test what rendering techniques do. They make the differences between techniques really visible, which is awesome. In our case, we ran into a couple of weird things. This was actually trying to figure out if it was how the fastest way to switch material colors. And so I think at the time we had material.color, which anyone knows is leaky and bad and slow. And I was comparing it to using property blocks, or property blocks, is that the, yeah. And a couple of other methods. And also how to set the color. Do I set it do I use a color lerp between red and blue, or do I use a defined color gradient and then use an evaluate, or do I use a lookup table? It's like, I don't know, what's the difference? So as it turned out, the evaluating a curve actually was outperformed lerp, and lookup table was slightly faster, or actually in some cases it was much faster, but it turned out that it was not actually the lookup table that was faster. It was because when you have 10,000 wasps and you randomize the color across the full range, you actually have up to 10,000 color variations, while the lookup table only has like 250 or whatever you set it to. the moment I quantized the evaluate back to 256 values, they were comparable. So it turned out there wasn't any saving there anyway. It just was an illusion. And in our game, we don't have that many characters on screen, so it wouldn't have even benefited it. And performance varies wildly between platforms. Different systems work differently on on consoles. Most people know that mobile versus PC is a very different beast, but PC to console is also surprisingly different. We had costs on physics at the time that were much higher than on PC proportionally, and they were surprising. It turned out some optimizations could be to replace a physics system with a pure script system, and we got back considerable savings. But on the PC, it didn't make a difference. And it was just knowing that that kind of stuff could and was in the game, which made it all the difference. We also got burnt a few times waiting for Unity to save us, and that wasn't so good. So this is a few examples of the way the levels transform in our game. I'm just gonna.
Firepower. Battery here.
Insufficient. Switching on.
This boss is so large it can't fit on the stage. It has to reach up and attack you with its arms. So that was that's the kind of style of gameplay we were trying to do across the games. So the important thing to us though was that the levels weren't gimmicks. They all just had a theme or an attitude or a point to them, something that made them unique. And the reason why we wanted to push for that was to make memorable gameplay experiences. We wanted to give the player the sense that they didn't know what was coming up next. It was an arena shooter, but you don't know what that means. It could mean the arena changes. We had moving stages that would move you down a corridor. We had a moving train, which was largely a visual effect. But in each case, the goal was to kind of make the player think that we could do whatever we wanted, which is pretty impressive when you're talking about a 3-person indie team. And we can't do what we want, but it's like a magic trick. I always think about the magician that raises the woman up and runs a hoop across them, and you're kind of trying to figure out what they're doing. And if they do their job right, you start getting convinced that they could just do whatever they wanted. And the reason why they put what they do in their show is just because that's what they felt like choosing. And that's kind of an attitude that we wanted to take with our game. And everything supports the gameplay. Everything has a gameplay function. Sometimes it's just thematics about gating one area of gameplay to another. Like the level where the lights turn on and off, we use different enemy types. So in the light, you're fighting larger enemies that require more zoning control. And when the lights turn off, we use swarming enemies. And so it's that alternation between fighting large enemies in the light and then having to fight smaller enemies in retreat. And we go back and forward between that a few times, increasing the intensity. And that was about creating the rhythm of the gameplay. So it's not just about we can turn the lights off, on and off, woo! Everything had a purpose and a very intent purpose to the game. The other thing I hadn't talked about too much is that we have 9 player characters that each have different weapons. So you probably saw Cactus. I should have mentioned, actually, the reason why the game is called Assault Android Cactus is because it's about an android called Cactus. And she uses a machine gun and a flamethrower as her 2 weapons. The other 8 characters, we have Holly. She uses a Seeker homing gun. This is Lemon. She uses a spread shot and a rocket launcher. Shotgun and a plasma field, lasers and homing missiles. Aubergine uses a little flying drone and a black hole gun. Shiitake uses a rail gun and propeller mines, which are proximity mines. And Peanut uses a magma welder and a giant rocket-powered drill. And Licorice uses a cannon and a teleporting knife attack. So, so the goal there was to create a lot of, extra gameplay, obviously. That's the reason why you have multiple playable characters in the game. But it came back to that idea of trying to mine a twin-stick shooter, or redefine what it was. You could pick up, we could have made it that you picked up weapons during gameplay and you switched that way, but we thought it was better to have a character with a two-weapon set that you would learn to master, and then you could return to the game and use another character to basically do it all over again. We were trying to trace gameplay that we hadn't seen in other games and also in our own game. We did a lot of the development publicly because of the early access, and we had our first 5 characters set up with traditional weapons. But then the next character we introduced was Aubergine, who uses a spinning drone weapon. It's a little guy called Hilo that flies out and propellers around and can switch to a black hole gun. That was based on a discussion we had midway in the project where I think she had a variation on a machine gun, and it was like, okay, it's a different type of machine gun, but we've got this before. We've got like a couple of types. We've got a laser gun, we've got a straight shooting gun, we've got a spreading gun. Like, what's different about this as a gun? And so we decided to just throw it open and see what we could come up with. And at one point, I was suggesting a little kind of Zergling-style enemy that could run up and attack your enemies. And it was totally out of scope and a ridiculous idea. But there was something about that, the idea of commanding another unit to do your fighting. We thought, well, what if we could dial that back to something that we could actually put in the game? And we ended up with Hilo, which worked a lot better. He was mechanically sound. He could travel across gaps. If he gets separated from you, he teleports back. And she's one of the more divisive characters in the game. Some people can't stand her, some people only play as her, and it's great. And the important thing is that it established that the game could do that, and that you could have characters that weren't what people were expecting inside the framework of this extremely balanced, competitive, high-score chasing twin-stick shooter. The final thing was it was player expression. Just like you pick a character in Street Fighter and feel like you own that character, people have their favorites in Cactus. And we see that a lot. People get very attached in the Steam community to their favorite character and will trash talk other people and will talk about why their character's awesome, or take it as a personal challenge to put them higher on a level's leaderboard. And it's like, that's the kind of interaction we really, really wanted to have with our players, so I'm so glad it worked out. This is more of a explanation of the development of the game. We did a lot of traveling. We did a lot of the showing ourselves. You can probably see from the lookup thing. We also did it on a budget because we were poor and running out of money. A lot of the times we were surfing couches or getting 2-for-1 flights or taking invites to things. But we did what we could. And we managed to make our own luck in a lot of ways. We went to Tokyo Game Show. That was a highlight for me because it's like, woo, Tokyo Game Show. And we ended up meeting a few people that we worked with in the business side of things just because they were there. And it's hard to know, could we have done that without being physically on the ground? Either case, it was great for us because we got to meet so many other developers. We got to see people hands-on with the game. A lot of the development was done through conventions and also early access. Early access would give us our hardcore players, but conventions would give us the kind of players that had never played the game before, and we'd get to see what they thought of it too. And so between the two of them, we actually had a reasonably good idea of how people were going to interact with the game. Which brings me to the polish phase. So because of the long development, we ended up being able to really, we just kept polishing as we went. I had a personal attitude that if I was going to do early access, I didn't want to contribute to the kind of broken games that people had, why early access had a bad reputation at the time. So I worked very hard to squash every bug I knew of before we put updates out. And that was partly out of pride, and also because our game was a very competitive score-based game, and I needed to know that the scores people were setting were valid. If you put in a bug and you can get enemies trapped in a box, maybe people will start using that strategy to get higher scores, and that's completely not the kind of thing we're testing for. So for us, it was really important to have that high quality bar, and for players, it meant that they felt validated by the decision to get on board with the early access, and we had a very positive community for the most part. The other thing was really interesting was that as we fixed bugs, we kept discovering new bugs to fix, which seems kind of an obvious thing or a bad thing, but it's that triple-cooked approach to game development, which I think is how you achieve excellence somehow. It's that ability to make the game functional, to make it tick all the boxes, and then look at it and see what else it needs, which is how you can kind of build in the sort of the extra polish and the extra fixes that make a game go from being all right and ticking the boxes to being something that people really fondly remember. Also on Jeff's side, he had the entire project. He had 3 years to iterate on the music. He was working part-time, so he'd take other gigs because he was a very good musician. Jeff Van Dyke, he created the BAFTA award-winning soundtrack to Shogun Total War, and has a huge array of credits, so he's very, very good and part of our team. And yeah, he got to iterate over the songs and the sound design, the whole project, and you can hear it when you're playing the game, which is great. Sort of more technical side of things, we actually didn't use very many plugins for the most part. A lot of the game was trying to be very specific. I had very exacting conditions for how gameplay would function. So for instance, it wouldn't be acceptable to use a gameplay controller because I really wouldn't understand how it worked. So everything that the player touched and everything that was performance important was basically me. But obviously, you know, we use plugins where we can, particularly post effects, because that's something that I didn't really know that much about. And Rewired ended up being a huge boon. That was the controller library. At a time when Unity's controller support wasn't the greatest, it really saved us on PC, because people would say, hey, my off-brand PS2 style USB gamepad doesn't work, what's with that? And it's like, I don't know, I don't want to know. And Rewired ended up taking care of a lot of that, which is great. We actually did huge amounts of the development in-house, partly because we didn't know any better, partly because we were poor. I still remember at PAX once, we were talking with some of the other indies, and they were saying, oh yeah, which artist, like there were two indies were talking to each other, and they're saying, oh yeah, so the artist that you get to do your banner art. And I was like, you get an artist to do your banner art? It's like, I just got sent the specs and started working on stuff, so it's like, oh wow. But in the end, we worked with Bay Area Sound to do the recording you saw in the intro. That was after we tried to record our friends and family, actually, and it ended up sounding extremely Australian. I don't know if you guys get neighbours here, but it sounded a bit like that, and we're like, we'll just downplay that. And ultimately, we just realized we weren't going to get a good enough performance, so that was an area where we were willing to splurge a bit. When I say splurge, Bay Area Sound came and worked with us. We explained who we were up front, and they did a great job of keeping everything really contained. We ended up marketing the game ourselves for the most part, but towards the end we realized we really sucked at it and it wasn't our forte. So we ended up getting Stride PR involved, and they really helped with the launch push. Unfortunately, the game didn't blast out of the gates, but I was still really happy with how Stride PR managed our messaging and how many people they managed to reach at conventions. And Playism, who localized and released the game in Japan, which we met at Tokyo Game Show. That was one of those fortuitous meetings. So in terms of how it all went, you know, we made a game, it was pretty good, people liked it. The subtext was that it didn't sell great, but it did sell. It came out, we're not broke. The game continues to sell. We're in a Steam sale at the moment, I think, and you know, it came out like a year and a half ago. We found extra opportunities. We worked with a company called IndieBox that did a physical retail release of indie games, and yeah, that worked out pretty nicely. That our fans appreciated it. We collaborated with EB Games Australia to do a giveaway at Christmas. So they gave us a lump sum payment for that and distributed the game to members that were high enough in their rewards tier. And we also did Humble Bundle, which, you know, Wasn't the biggest bundle, but still, it was all these things added up to mean that we kept financially solvent, and it came in. We had a long tail, and we still have a long tail, and we still haven't finished yet. Now onto the postmortem part of the postmortem. I'm going to go through this a bit quickly. So obviously the game took too long. It would have been great if we'd finished in a year and a half, but we actually worked steadily on it. Nothing went terribly wrong. It just took too long. It didn't even blow out. We were not able to release simultaneously on different platforms. We announced at one point on PC, PS4, Vita, and Wii U. And while we've done PC and then followed up with PS4, we so far haven't managed to do Vita or Wii U for technical reasons and scope reasons and things scrolling out of control. The name was really bad. It's hard to say. A lot of journalists would hear Android and immediately assume Google platform. Some people would hear Assault and assume that kind of like lower grade tower, like waves of enemies kind of thing. In the end, it was a clunky name. We still don't have a better one. The people that like the game kind of think the game name's cool, and we struggled to find a message. When I was describing the game earlier, trying to say it's a twin stick, most people go, oh, it's got transforming levels, it's set in a vivid sci-fi universe. We really struggled with how to make people interested in the game, other than saying it's a twin stick, but it's good, which no one believes, right up until the end of the project. And early access actually limited our ability to market because we weren't an exciting unknown quantity. Journalists didn't want to cover the game because we weren't launching out of nowhere. We were freely available to anybody who wanted it. And so we ended up having to get a lot of our coverage by courting people by saying, oh, we're adding a new feature. Do you want to check it out before anyone else gets it? So what went right is we had strong gameplay from the beginning, kept it, made it better. Game never sucked. I enjoyed playing it from start to now, which is pretty impressive, and a feature that I've never had on any of the games I've ever worked on before. We built a development roadmap and followed it. We only cut a couple little things, but we added something cool that ended up being a feature that people still play daily today, which is awesome. We had a great early access community that were really keen about wanting us to succeed, and so they would go out and help us in various ways and give us good feedback, and they would almost be like our mouthpieces when people were talking about the game elsewhere. And we shipped with the 22nd highest Metacritic for a PlayStation 4 game in 2016. I actually just double-checked. We were the third highest Unity game in 2016 on PS4, and I think fifth highest indie game in general. So like, we're kind of up there. I was pretty happy about that. All of those games made a lot more money than us. So we didn't go broke. We have enough money to keep going, which is like successful indie startup. We're still pursuing a few extra options with Cactus. It's not dead yet. We'll wring more money out of that thing. And we're working on multiple projects at the moment, prototyping. And they're all Unity-based and all console-focused, because we're finding that was a space where we feel most comfortable in. And also, we have connections with various hardware and platform owners now. And so we feel kind of more comfortable pursuing that space going forwards. Thank you. That's my talk.